training at the University of the West Indies, and I will be your chair for this evening's conversation titled The Impact of the Venezuelan Migration on Trinidad and Tobago, a Geopolitical Analysis. This conversation is being hosted by the Trade and Economic Development Unit, TEDU for short, at the University of the West Indies. For some time, the TEDU has been using its national conversation platform as a forum to facilitate engagement between experts on the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The objective of these conversations is to ensure that the public is informed of critical information on and analysis of the economy in a timely manner. 5 million. That is the estimated number of migrants and refugees that have fled Venezuela, according to work published by the IOM last year. The political turmoil and socioeconomic instability in Venezuela has been precipitated what has been called the worst ever refugee crisis in the Americas. Of those fleeing, the main destinations have been and continue to be Colombia, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Brazil, with Colombia accommodating almost 2 million refugees and migrants. For us in Trinidad and Tobago, our main concern involves the impact of the approximately 50,000 Venezuelans who have migrated to Trinidad and Tobago over the past 3 years. In past sessions, we have examined the impact of the Venezuelan migration on the economy, the labor market, and most recently, our development. Today, we turn to the question of the geopolitical impact. It is important for us to note the geopolitical context in which this migration crisis is occurring. To describe the relationship between Venezuela and the US as a challenged one would be an understatement, especially given the US sanctions imposed in 2019, which froze all Venezuelan government assets in the US and barred transactions with US companies and citizens. At the same time, Venezuela has consistently courted and increasingly deepened relations with Russia and China, both of whom have strained relations with the US. It is in light of this context that we seek to examine the impact of the Venezuelan migration on Trinidad and Tobago. To do so, we look to our panelists. On this evening's panel, we have first Mr. Gavin Hira, our lead presenter. He is a strategic security expert, Homeland Security and Safe City Operations, and former executive director of the National Operations Center. Next, we have Dr. Tiwari, former Minister of Planning and former Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Dr. Roger Hussein, Senior Economist at the UE and Coordinator of the TEDU. Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, Retired Director of the Institute of International Relations at UE. Dr. David Lewis, Vice President at Manchester Trade and Co-Director and Fellow of the New Caribbean Policy Consortium based in Washington, DC and the Caribbean. And Mr. Felipe Munoz Gomez, Migration Unit Chief at the Inter-American Development Bank. Just a couple of meeting announcements before we begin. Please ensure that your microphones are muted when you are not speaking to prevent feedback. And also note that this session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. This evening's conversation will proceed as follows. We will begin with a presentation by Mr. Hira, followed by contributions by Drs. Tiwari, Hussein, Gonzalez, Lewis, and Mr. Gomez. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Hira to begin his presentation. Sure. Mr. Hira.
Thank you. Thanks again, Chris. Let me take this opportunity to say a very special good night to this esteemed panel, and again, in full appreciation and gratitude for the invitation to speak and some of the sidebar discussions, both with Rebecca, who's done such a fine job of putting it together, working behind the scenes, Dr. Gonzalez, and of course, Dr. Hussein. I thank you very much. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you. It's not going to be in a PowerPoint. It's not going to be dead by PowerPoint as such. We're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to present some information based on research that I have been doing and based on also the reality and the facts that my team has also been picking up. So I'm thankful again, and I will go straight into the conversation. Now, the title of tonight's presentation or conversation is called Impahadables with Slight Pepper. That's the theme. Impahadables with slight pepper. Because what has happened now, we are seeing that the doubles vendor is alongside the Empahada vendor, and there's something in the middle, Dr. Lewis, so sorry out there in Washington, called Impahadables, which is a mixture of Empahadas and doubles with slight pepper. So that's the title of our conversation this evening. Okay, guys? Empahadables with slight pepper. Rebecca says she loves it, so I'm looking forward to probably try and order 2 Empahadables with slight pepper for you, Becky. Christian, you were very correct in your opening preamble with regards to what is happening concerning Russia, concerning Venezuela and its alignment with Russia, China, and Iran because of the uranium. And we see a sort of connectivity, we see a synergy occurring there. So yes, there are sanctions by the US and some of the supporting nations. Venezuela has actually shifted its gear and associated itself with its allies and have basically business as usual to some extent. And it's so important that, you know, we have to understand in the region what is taking place coming out of Venezuela with the migration. It is such an important factor that we are gathered in the room here tonight, that we are having this conversation, and we are positioned to even, you know, field some questions from the panel, field some questions from the audience, but more so raise the conversation. This is Dr. Hussein had advocated earlier in my conversations with him, raise the conversations at a national level so as to raise awareness. So I want everyone to know tonight that this is not a Trinidad and Tobago problem. This is a regional problem as well as an international problem. And I don't say problem as something that we can't solve, problem as a cause for concern. And how do we impact now? How do we ascertain that whole concept of what is taking place and how is that impacting Trinidad and Tobago? And that is where I want to take this conversation. So it's going to be presented basically in 3 lenses, the local, the regional, and the international. And I'll be using the analytical model of PESTLE, the PESTLE, to go into the geopolitical analysis so as to bring some of the facts out, ask some questions rhetorically, and see where we can go with that. Okay, guys? So from the P, the political aspect. Just last week, and we may have been following what was taking place. Just last week, Juan Guaido would have engaged Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. We see that for a return of democracy. That was the heading, a return of democracy to Venezuela. And we see now conversations taking place at that level. In addition to that, he would have advocated at the political level in Venezuela for the opposition to have input in Venezuelans' newly electoral body. So we see something happening in the environment. We see an engagement by the US with Guaido again. And the question that we are saying now, asking is, we as CARICOM, we as Trinidad and Tobago must be paying attention to these developments. And I am not open here with the evidential facts tonight to present them statistically or to prove, but I'm not sure if CARICOM is prioritizing what is taking place in the outer environment as such, especially with that new twist with Guaido in the US and what is happening in the political aspect in Venezuela. So I am advocating, and I'm saying it tonight under the P of political, that there needs to be a concentrated effort in country. It cannot be a reactive effort by government that whenever the Venezuelan thing arises, again, we see some reactions, we see some issuing, we see some stuff, some public awareness, some media coverage, and then it dies down again. It has to have a concentrated effort. And a concentrated effort starts with an intergovernment approach. An intergovernment approach. And I would have said it before in a couple of public domains that part of that intergovernment approach, probably what we're needing to see now is a sort of task force being set up at the government level, inclusive of experts, so as to have a concentrated effort on the Venezuelan migration. I don't think we have that yet, and it is important to understand how that thing is twisting. The environment is changing incrementally, and we will have to change incrementally here in Trinidad, and I'll speak some of that coming in as we go on later in the presentation. So there's a need for prioritization. I think it is needed now for us to see a prioritization by our government and a political will so as to treat with these issues and not a reactive will as we are seeing presently. There must be a political will and we must see prioritization to treat with the Venezuelan migration. You see, the situation is continuing, and we must now be evaluating our capacity. And capacity building is extremely important because we have this increase of Venezuelans coming through our migration system, some illegal, which we'll talk about later on again, as I said. But do we have the capacity in country to treat with it? And from a political standpoint, capacity building needs to be at the top of the agenda, needs to be a front burner so as to treat with the expansion and the additional issues that are facing us in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to shift a little bit and head off to the E, which is the economic impact, because I know we only have 20-25 minutes. Some of the extensions and the expansion I can do when we have the further discussions. But the E, the economic impact. There are economic gains and there are economic fallouts regarding the Venezuelan migration. So there are both gains and there are fallouts. For instance, the question that was asked based on my probing and my research in the intelligence team is, are we in country, for instance, interested in advancing or investing, I should say, in the blue economy? And I know Dr. Hussein would have spoken on this on numerous occasions in different forums, because the question that is now being presented is that the Venezuelan migration, for instance, can be a definite platform for such an investment if we are focusing in country on the blue economy. And I'm not sure if that is happening. The agricultural sector, for instance, stands as a good launch pad for consideration. But have we looked at the agricultural sector? Have we looked at food security as a significant investment so that we can entertain the investment regarding the blue economy in the agricultural sector and promote the food security, utilizing the Venezuelan migration with some sort of structure and order? So under E for economy, I'm sort of like putting that out. Now, the question that was raised in our surveys and our consultation was, is money coming into Trinidad and Tobago regarding the migration, or is money leaving Trinidad and Tobago regarding the migration? And this is where it pivots, because there is a thriving business, you know, and some of it not legitimate, but there's a thriving business. For instance, the business of the boat trade. There's a boat trade that takes place where people are brought over at X amount of US dollars a head, and that's a thriving business. So money is coming in there in a certain way. But what we have found out statistically is that real estate, groceries, supermarkets to some extent, they have shown a marked increase. Small business enterprises have also benefited from cheap available labor. So you know, there is some sort of turnaround from an economy based on the availability of the Venezuelans through the migration. Yes. But we cannot dismiss the fact that there's also a rise and an involvement of what is known as TOC, transnational organized crime. We have seen that starting to show its head. So there's a rise of money making illegally based on transnational organized crime. And the linkage is based on the Delta de la Macuro with the mega bandas, which is an organized gang that is part of the transnational organized crime movement in LATAM, in Latin America. That has found its way into the shores of Trinidad and Tobago. And I don't see this as a hearsay. I'm saying this based on information that is available out there. So I want to move across to the S. And under the S in the pestle, social services, the sex trade, and security, which we will elaborate on. Can we, in Trinidad and Tobago, or are we equipped to deliver the increased demand of social services that is riding the wave of the Venezuelan migration? And I'm asking this, throwing it back out there to our people, those who are in position to answer. Do you think Trinidad and Tobago has the capacity, hence it comes back at this again, capacity building, to treat with the increased demand of social services? The question that comes out is, what is the entitlement? What is going to be the entitlement of the Venezuelans once registered as it relates to social services? Because there is a cost. There is a cost to the delivery of social services. And therefore, social services has to be considered. And that's a whole lecture by itself on what is available, what is the entitlement, and what is going to be in place. Let's talk about the sex trade, or what is known in some circles as the flesh trade. Before COVID had hit Trinidad and Tobago, this beloved country, Trinidad and Tobago, was being identified as a sex tourism destination. So you find people were leaving all over the world to come to Trinidad for sex tourism. Presently, that concept of the flesh trade and the sex tourism continues, but it is continuing on the low as a thriving business, well organized, well structured, and firewalled. And I say this with a Black Prado clientele. So part of that Venezuelan migration is the promotion and the existence, and more so the growth and the expansion of the sex trade. So there is a thriving business with a Black Prado clientele of the sex trade existing here in Trinidad and Tobago. Security. What we have seen, and when I say we guys, I'm talking about my team, I'm talking about those who are working with me with regard to the information gathering and doing the surveys, asking the question, the intelligence probes and that type of stuff. We have seen with evidence a cross-fertilization of criminality between Latin America, and the Trinidad and Tobago. And emerging slowly in the center is a new type of criminal, a new face of criminal. We would have seen recently where we had Venezuelans and I think Colombians being held for fraud and for the card, for bank card fraud and that type of stuff. Very small, but a lot of stuff is happening in the background. So there's now a cross-fertilization, guys, between the Latin American criminality and the local criminality. The question is, what is our strategy as it relates to immigration and the prison service? Because we are presently bursting at our seams, capacity comes back again for the holding bays for those who are to be deported, Venezuelans who are being rotated out of country for illegal entry. Where have we sat down with a task force type of mentality, focused with a concentrated effort to treat with capacity building to deal specific with the Venezuelan migration and those who are here on illegal entry? Which brings me to the point. My team was able to pick up that it is alleged at this point, many people don't want to go to Shaka Shakari anymore. Many people would not venture into Shaka Shakari to tie up their boats and have a day of fun and whatever. And the question was asked why? Because it is alleged that there are Venezuelans on the island there illegally who may pounce on them, who may accost them in some way for food or for money or whatever. There are people camping out and hiding on the island of Shaka Shakari. That's what I was told. Certain questions were asked, and it's not the kind of statistics that I can prove here in the public domain, but it is alleged. And when you get that type of information, you log it as a FYI and you continue to probe. Continuing to probe, we were told that many people who are involved in the human smuggling and that human trafficking, and it has continued to be an error where a number of authorized signatures and people who are speaking use the terms and they mistake what they're saying erroneously. Some are quoting human trafficking when in fact we're talking about human smuggling. People paying money to come across the border for their own safety and security, and they're engaging people along the boat trade to bring them over. What has happened? Those who have paid money to come over have been dropped off in the dead of night onto Shaka Shakari, and the boatman says, "You're rich," meaning you are here in Trinidad and Tobago. They leave them there on the island and they're left. They're just left there. Others have been thrown overboard. Boat starts to take in water. Situation out there in the Grand Bocas, they're thrown overboard and have to swim and have made their way to Shaka Shakari. This I've told is facts, guys. These are the facts. So there is a situation concerning security and Shaka Shakari, and we're going to continue to probe to whether this is right or not, or to justify or any veracity to what we picked up. But I am saying and advocating this afternoon with this forum that there's a need to consider a MIATF, for MIATF, which is the Maritime Interagency Task Force to treat with our border control management, a combination of the key agencies given the primacy with a concentrated effort. You hear me say that throughout the night. from a task force mentality, a task force thinking to treat with our border control management. So as we move from the S, let's talk about some threats. There are numerous threats that are emanating now from that Venezuelan migration and coming out of that. The health threat. Now we are seeing yellow fever on a rise. It is not being promulgated too much in the public domain, but there's a rise in yellow fever in the southern or southwestern peninsula, in the monkeys, and you know, we are seeing it. And that has come out of South America. So there's a health risk. There's an agriculture risk regarding biosecurity. And those issues are on the table. Plants and animals are being brought over with very little detection, very little checks and balances. And if this continues to happen, we can have infections in our agriculture system. So there's an agricultural risk, which has led to an agricultural threat. The threat of transnational organized crime remains very real. I mentioned it earlier, guys. And there's evidence that young Venezuelan girls are being abused sexually by their employers and by perpetrators, and they cannot report these incidents because they may be here illegally, or their passports are held, or they're held under duress, given somewhere to live, that type of stuff. So this is happening, and that threat is very, very real. I want to just touch base a little bit on the L, the legislative agenda. Trinidad and Tobago at this point will need to advance a legislative agenda. It is important regarding the Venezuelan migration. We will have to look at some international models. We would have to, and it's important to understand that Senor Munoz is here and Dr. Lewis is here, of what is taking place in that international realm that we can consider regarding advancing a legislative agenda focusing on the Venezuelan migration, that puts some structure, that puts some regulations and regulatories in place to treat with the issue. Now, under L again, as for the advancement of the legislative agenda, under L is the language issue. I think it is by now we should have seen that Spanish should be promoted as a second language here in Trinidad and Tobago, amongst the private and the public sector, amongst the protective services. Spanish speaking should be part of the training for the defense force, the police service, the prison service. We need to see that. And it is very, very important to treat with the L, because you're walking into business places, you're going to certain areas in Trinidad and Tobago, and you have to catch yourself actually on Google or whatever, talking Spanish, because the person who's attending to you or who's within the system, in order providing a service. So we are at that point where Spanish needs to be advanced now as a compulsory, mandatory second language for Trinidad and Tobago. And the last L is logistics. Logistics. I go back to the capacity building and infrastructure. You know, we said in Trinidad and Tobago there used to be an old joke that we had 2 lanes of traffic because nobody thought that there would be 1 million cars on the road in Trinidad and Tobago. So halfway down in our planning, we then started to expand our roads. Nobody had the vision to where this was going. I'm saying at this point, there has to be a consideration of capacity building and for infrastructure, a specific infrastructure, for instance, that can house and hold Venezuelans who are here illegally and in position for deportation and repatriation. We should have a special infrastructure, but not mixed with the normal system. You know, we have to consider from a strategic standpoint, from a political will, from a governmental, intergovernmental task force, these types of developments. I close with the E, environment, culture, and demographics. Whether we like it or not, in the next 10 or 15 years, the face of the Trinidadian is going to look different. Whether we like it or not, it's going to happen. And I'm saying 10 or 15, it could be more than that. But we're going to have a different look to the Trinidadian because of the Venezuelan migration. But that continues to come. That continues. There's no stopping there. And we are starting to see that intertwining, interlocking impahadables with slight pepper. The face of the Trinidadian is going to be somebody different. Trinbagonian, I should say. The question that I want to throw out to the team tonight is, who's capturing the history? Who's recording the transformation? Who is going to tell the stories? Sooner or later, this migration, our decisions, the impact and the fallouts of the Venezuelan migration on Trinidad and Tobago and CARICOM will be necessary as a focal point for our studies and our research in Caribbean history. It is going to find its way into the syllabus. It's going to find its way. It should be finding its way into the syllabus. It should be finding its way along the lines of what is now that new trend in Caribbean history studies. And the Venezuelan migration is fitting itself in there. But who's capturing the history? Who's writing the decisions? Who's commenting on them? And that is why I'm focused and I'm thankful for the conversation starting at this level tonight to make that impact. I close by advocating strongly that there's a need for an RTVA conducted especially on the impact of the Venezuelan migration on CARICOM, a risk, threat, and vulnerability assessment. An RTVA needs to be conducted with urgency. Other countries are facing similar situations. We see what's happening with Guyana. We see what's happening with that report, whether it's true or false, of the aerial surveillance with the fighter jets and stuff, but we're starting to see some stuff happening, guys. And if we don't conduct a professional RTVA, risk, threat, and vulnerability assessment, we can be caught napping. I close by saying 2 empahadables with slight pepper. Thank you very much tonight. Thank you, guys. I stand by with the panel.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Commander Hira. I think it was quite well received by our audience and our panelists. Next, I'd just like to invite Dr. Tiwari to jump in here to give his comments and thoughts on what was shared by Commander Hira. Dr. Tiwari. Oh, sorry, Dr. Tiwari, you'll have to unmute your microphone.
Okay. Yeah, I'll venture a couple of comments, reactions initially. You know, the Commander Hira outlined a situation for us in which he basically presented what he called the problems that need not be insurmountable, but he wanted to highlight them. And he divided them into various areas: political, economic, security issues, etc. And when presented like that, it to the person listening or reading something like that, it becomes a formidable challenge and a kind of threat, and with the possibility of alteration of the character and functionality of the society. And I think to some extent that is true. But I would like to ask some basic questions. I mean, one of the things we explored here before was the fact that we had those who were registered, a few thousand, 12,000 maybe, and those who were not registered, which would be twice, sometimes 3 times that. And we are now undergoing what is being termed a re-registration exercise. And the minister has said emphatically that he doesn't want any of the illegal Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago showing up for that. And I suppose what he means is, first of all, to acknowledge that they are illegals. And secondly, to let them know that they won't be registered. But wouldn't our country benefit if these people showed up and we could take the information and we would at least know who is here and perhaps decide what needs to be done with these people? In other words, it becomes an opportunity for identification of who are the Venezuelans really on our soil, not only those who need to be re-registered, but we get a fair idea of who are. The second thing is the issue on Munoz. I mean, I can understand that that is happening. I must say, this is the first time I'm hearing that you have Venezuelan residents on,
It's Shaka
on
Shakari.
Chaka Shakari, sorry. This is the first time that I'm hearing that you have actual Venezuelan residents on Shaka Shakari. But I want to ask the question as I've asked many times before, what is the Coast Guard doing? And if that information is true, or even if we suspect that that information might be true, I would expect that we would want to check it out and perhaps send some military with the Coast Guard to walk through the island and to round up who are the people who are there. I suspect that it cannot be 1,000 people, and it probably is not 100. And there are certain things that we can do to take charge, so to speak, of the island, and to, once you address that particular situation, you could then decide how you want to treat with the 5 islands that are off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago, and actually closer to Venezuela than the larger landmass. So I mentioned those things simply as a reaction, and there's some questions. And I also acknowledge the very real scenario that Commander Hira is painting, that requires, and I think he emphasized this over and over, a kind of task force mentality and thinking, so you are on top of the situation at all points in time, both the geopolitics and the actual migration and the content of the migrants, who they are and what they do, etc. And secondly, to be constantly alert to the fact that you are dealing with a threat or a risk that has to be assessed and managed. So I want to acknowledge that that is a useful approach and a useful proposition. Now, I had said that I would say something. How many minutes I have now? Maybe 4 minutes more. I had said that I would say something about what might help to make for successful immigration strategy for Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to come back perhaps to something that I said before and something other people have said, which is that I don't see how you can have any kind of approach to managing the inflow of migrants in Trinidad and Tobago unless you had some kind of policy clarity on immigration. And that would include the legislative requirements that Commander Hira mentioned. I think we talked about that sometime before. And there are things that we have to do. There are laws that are sort of hung up. We started the process, we did not complete them. And there are things that we can do to make the situation clear. And legislation might be the basis on which you could have policy clarity. It is not the only thing, but you do need to have the legislative basis. The second thing is we have to recognize, and I think Commander Hira was focusing on that the immigration process has to be managed. You can't just let people flow into your country like that. You cannot just let things happen once they get here. And you cannot allow the process to simply evolve in a haphazard, laissez-faire way and hope to have a result that might turn out to be desirable. I think there is a real problem with that. So I think besides the legislation and the policy clarity, we need to have a recognition that this thing has to be managed, and that we need not just the processes, but to establish a system to make the process work. And we need actions sequenced in such a way and managed within the context of a system in order to create systemic order for this new phenomenon that is happening at a rapid pace and all at once, so to speak, in Trinidad and Tobago, the Venezuelan immigration to Trinidad and Tobago. I think we've got to make some kind of pronouncement and commitment as to how, first of all, whether we see integration as an active policy, and to see this integration process under conditions of democracy, because that is important. And secondly, what does this active policy entail in the context of policy clarity about immigration, in the context of a legislative framework that is clear and well established according to international norms and humane criteria. And thirdly, as part of a systemic order that you are trying to establish in order to make this integration work. I've said this on many occasions, and other people have said it as well in some of the sessions that we have, which is that immigration strategy must be part of a wider development strategy. If you don't have a development strategy for your country that is clear, with policy priorities and some kind of estimation of where you are likely to be or where you are headed or what is the desirable place, let's say in 5 years, 7 years, whatever it is, I don't see how the immigration strategy could be a valid strategy if it is not linked to that. So that the immigration plan is part of a wider, larger national plan. And you need both to work in synergy and in sync. I think we need to recognize that people migrate for various reasons, but in the case of Venezuela, by and large, it is in search of personal opportunity and economic opportunity in the face of economic and political collapse, really. And by economic and by political collapse, I do not mean that the government has fallen. I mean that the institutions of state are now failing to function in the interests of the citizens. And as a consequence, there is a political collapse as well as economic deterioration. Now, I think, which is why I was mentioning the business of the immigrants, of us trying to use the opportunity to find out all the Venezuelans who are here, whether they are legal or illegal, because I think we need an assessment and analysis to know who the immigrants are and what they can do so that they can be valuably deployed. I think those things would be essential in managing the migration process and in making immigration successful in Trinidad and Tobago from the point of view of the Venezuelans coming in and our being able to receive them humanely and strategically in terms of an economic strategy as part of a development plan. Now, I know these commentators like myself at this point were only supposed to have 7 minutes. There's much, much more that I can say, but I will try to stick within the time. I hope I have not gone over it, but I'll stop at this point.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution, your questions, and your thoughts, Dr. Tiwari. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Hussein to jump in here.
Thank you very much, Christian, and excellent presentation by Gavin. I was trying to pronounce if it is empanadables or empanadables. Empahadables. Okay, excellent. I will use that phrase, so I'm giving you notice. You know, it was a very interesting conversation, and my mind paid particular attention to when you mentioned
Dr. Hussein, could you put your camera on, please?
Sorry, yes.
Let the audience see you.
Sorry about that. And my mind paid particular attention when you mentioned the registering. And I noticed Dr. Tiwari also mentioned the re-registration exercise. So on a previous iteration of this conversation, myself, Dr. Tiwari, and Professor Gonzalez, we discussed the number of Venezuelans here, and building on the comments that was made by people like Living Waters and other groups. I hope I remember the group correct. We agreed, we saw the number 40,000 being floated about, and I suggested that in the context of the newspaper clippings of the different amount of Venezuelans coming and onto our shores, it's probably closer to 60,000. Mm-hmm. And on the assumption that that 60,000 is true, with 15,525, I believe, registered, it means that almost 3/4 of the Venezuelans that are here are not registered. Correct. And to me, it makes absolutely no sense to miss the boat of registering those who are here for the purposes of national security, for the purpose of having a database in terms of the skill capacity of these Venezuelans, so we could link their skills and their various labor market attributes with the gaps in our own labor market for the benefit of our non-energy export production. Now, we have had very lengthy conversations in the past, and I'm not going to go into it here, as to where the Venezuelans work. My simplistic view is that I see the majority of Venezuelans working in the non-tradable and perhaps even in the informal non-tradable segment of the economy. And that's the worst possible place they could work from a current account balance perspective. It's a tremendous error that we need to fix, because it will lead to a drain on our current account balance, and we need to fix that now. So moving forward, I think I agree fully with your idea of the task force. And to me, the lack of urgency in this is worrying, because we have an economy that is in a complicated situation. We have had no growth since 2009, basically. Our production of our main comparative advantage goods is on the decline, and we need to do something about the medium-term prospects. And if it is the medium-term prospects does not lie in energy as much as it did 20 years ago, and I see my good friends from the University of Guyana they are on, I think Guyana would have to be particularly careful about it, but that's a separate conversation. But what I would say is that we need to make use of this current factor boom. We mismanaged the last factor boom, which was the gas boom. We mismanaged the factor boom before that, which was the oil boom. And we now have a labor market boom, and I dare say unskilled labor market boom, with the word unskilled being used in relation to the fact that there is a language barrier. Correct. But there are tremendous opportunities available, as well as risks that have to be managed. And so we need to dig deep and a habit of my country, it's my observation, is that we react when it's a bit too late. So that when we had a golden opportunity to save the larger part of the $53 billion in energy rents that we made since 2000, we implemented a HSF. I think the HFS started in 2008. By that time, in my view, the horse had already bolted.
Yeah, we missed the boat.
And what had happened at that point in time is the consumption habits we developed were out of sync with logic. And therefore, the economy is where we are today, mainly because of endogenous macroeconomic policy errors. Bad management, terrible. And my view is that, therefore, we need to register everyone. We need to collect data on their skills, and we need to push this task force that Gavin has so eloquently outlined. And Gavin, in one of the questions I asked if you could detail 5 objectives of the task force, just for, if some of it you would have mentioned, but if you could pin it down in 5 bulleted points, so to say, so we could be very clear, then we could use that information to drive the only thing I think that will give Trinidad and Tobago a chance of a return to sustainable growth, which is emphasis on how to build our non-energy export sector. That's where all the solution lies, and that's where this economy would either make or break, in my view, in the medium-term period. Almost every sector of our economy before COVID, and I emphasize before COVID-19, in Trinidad and Tobago was under strain. And I am prepared to debate this with anyone. We have had very bad economic growth numbers. Our corruption perception index is in the wrong place. Ease of doing business is in the wrong place, and a number of things like that. And so this particular factor boom must be treated as sacred and golden. And we have to take what we can from this for benefits, both to the Venezuelans from a humanitarian perspective and to the Trinidad and Tobago economy from a foreign exchange, a stock of foreign exchange perspective. When we interact and embrace our humanitarian efforts, it must be respectful to our stock of foreign exchange, which is on the decline. So I will stop there, and thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Hussein. Professor Gonzalez, I know you usually have a back and forth with Dr. Hussein. So.
Yes, thank you very much, Christian. And let me thank Commander Hira for his presentation. I must say it's well researched, and it is very detailed and empirical. I am really not in a position to react in any serious way, because I don't have a team to really investigate a lot of what he has raised. But nonetheless, I want to just, in a kind of a staccato fashion, go through some of the things he said, and at the same time, at the end, come back and look at the broader geopolitical problem and see what kind of impact that is having and what that is likely to have in the future. I think that is something we need to look at, given the fact of what has happened over the last 3 years, as well as what is likely to happen in the future. Now, Commander Hira did make several comments, and let me just, I was taking some notes here. I don't know if I got most of them, but the ones that I got, which I thought to be pretty useful, was first of all, the question of organized crime. Yes, this is an issue that has a history in this country, and I myself had raised it some years ago. We are in fact dealing with the development of criminal activity in Venezuela of a size and proportions that we have never seen before. This grew significantly under Chavez, and we have a significant amount of collectivos. Well, collectivos are not necessarily criminal gangs, but the way they were formed under the Chavez party, they more or less operate in that way. But side by side,
They're known as proxies.
Yeah, proxies. Yeah, well, they're sort of militia come gang in a way. You know, they're not exactly gangs in the sense that we know them. But side by side with those, you have the normal gangs that have existed. And way out in the region out here, close to us, for example, there are a number of them that operate. They're very much involved in the drug trade. And it's worrying when you look at how they have been spreading, because I've noticed, for instance, that you have these paramilitary organizations. For instance, you have the ELN and as well as FARC operating gold mines outside in the Orinoco region. I think to some extent they are given these mines to operate as a way of getting them to align themselves with the regime. And to some extent, when they come out in this part of the region, they're likely to pose a threat to us. I haven't heard much discussion of that, but I think we have to be concerned about it. We're well aware of all the gang structure and to what extent and that is involved in the drug trade here and the gun trade. We have followed that over the years, but these things are moving so fast that it's very difficult to keep track of it. I even saw today on the newspapers today, we had a kind of incident there which involved some kind of criminal activity from Venezuela. But let me say that looking at the capacity to absorb this Venezuelan migration, let's say, for example, in reference to the social services, the situation is indeed worrying. I must say I read the parliamentary report that looked at some of these things, and they show that, for instance, in education, there's a gap. I think they mentioned there was a gap of about 1,000 children that they were not able to place in government schools or were not able to be absorbed in private schools run by the Catholic Church. So there's a gap that we have there. To some extent, the health question is not too bad because most of them seem to be able to go to the public hospitals and get some kind of service. But I'm not sure to what extent that reflects the true situation, insofar some of them may require proper specialized care, which may not be available to them. So we do have a problem there with respect to health and education, not to mention some of the other social services. Now, the question of the people involved in human trafficking and smuggling. We have had a long history in this particular area. It goes way back since when I was a child, and which has never been able we have never been able to conquer this. It has existed over the years, and I remember a Trinidad diplomat to Caracas telling me that the old smuggling gangs, smuggling of illicit trade, whiskey and cigarettes and so forth, these gangs have just simply morphed into the drug gangs, and it's more or less the same people or their descendants which have continued to do that. So what we're witnessing to some extent is a continuation of the past, but just that it has morphed into a new kind of phenomena given what the demand is for certain things. So I agree with what he's saying about that kind of trafficking that has gone on. There's nothing new about the sex tourism trade. It has been around for a long, long time. And I don't know to what extent there's a surge. Obviously, there is a demand that has come up as a result of a greater supply, probably, but I'm not sure to what extent it might be out of bounds or out of control. Now, he did raise some important issues with respect to sanitary and phytosanitary matters with respect to plant and animal life, because we seem to be losing control in that area. And I could accept that because the flow is something that we cannot easily control. And let me say that when we're talking about border protection with respect to immigrants, my feeling is that we have to probably do like what the Europeans have done. As a matter of fact, the Europeans have shown that the only way you could successfully control this kind of migration is if you could stem it from the source. That is, if you could have people at the source acting in such a way to stop them from coming this way. The Europeans did that successfully with Gaddafi in Libya, and then after he was overthrown, things went haywire and people just started coming. To some extent, we as a small country may not easily have that option. We need to collaborate probably with the Venezuelan authorities to really get this done in a certain kind of a way. They must work with us to some extent to try to ensure that people don't come this way. Because I fear that with our best effort in border security, we will not be able to stop Venezuelans here who are likely to want to come this way. You know, just think about the distance and how easy it is to come from Venezuela to Trinidad. And you would see that if people are really desperate, it is going to be extremely difficult to really stop them. So I think we have to look in terms of how do we develop a different approach to border protection in such a way that we could operate much more closely down the main, as we say in this country, to try to deal with it. So these were some of the brief comments I had with respect to his observations. I think the observations are very timely. I would say finally that with respect to assessing this in CARICOM, it is worthwhile to try to undertake this, bearing in mind, of course, that in CARICOM it's only Jamaica and Trinidad and not Jamaica, sorry, Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago that are affected. I think if you look at, there are basically 5 Caribbean countries: the Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Curacao, and I think Aruba. There's another one, which I think is a Dutch country. Those are most of the Venezuelans who go to the Caribbean down. So I'm not sure if it's a wider CARICOM thing, maybe how useful a wider CARICOM is. But I take the point that it's something we need to look in terms of our vulnerability. Let me pivot to what I thought might be a useful complementary discussion, and that is the broader geopolitical context, and which is having an impact on this country. And I would say here that we are witnessing on our borders here a major geopolitical confrontation among the powers of the world. And we have lined up next to us here Russia, China, Iran, with Venezuela, as against the United States and the other Western powers. That's a major geopolitical context that we have to deal with. And over 3 years, all the measures that have been taken, the sanctions, okay, the humanitarian assistance, all these measures that have been taken have not been able to resolve this problem. This problem continues unabated with over 5 million refugees leaving by the end of 2020, and with the expected outflow to be roughly about 10 million, according to, I think, is the IMF or the World Bank or the OS. They did some studies showing by 2023, you would have roughly about 10 million refugees if things continue to go as they're going. And largely a lot of that has to do with the collapse of the Venezuelan economy. The economy has declined by 75%, 75–80%. You know, as we know, we all know, no need for me to go into details. The rates of hyperinflation, the total lack of food and medicines and so forth. And what we have seen is that essentially Venezuelans are fleeing, not so much because of human rights. They're fleeing largely because of the fact that they lack food and medicine. And this is unlike, for instance, situations that you may see in certain parts of Africa where people are running because of political conflict and a total denial of human rights. People are physically brutalized and that they flee. And you could visibly see that when they arrive in terms of the level of suffering. So that the question I'm asking myself is, how far is this situation going to continue in the future? The sanctions, in my view, are not working. The sanctions seem to bring on more hardship. I saw recently where the UN did a study, the UN Special Rapporteur did a study, and he showed a significant number of deaths resulting from these sanctions, directly related to these sanctions. He saw a serious denial in terms of nutrition, which was coming from the sanctions, directly again related to the sanctions. The fact that Venezuela cannot earn foreign exchange from selling oil leads to a tremendous impact on the Venezuelan people. And I think we have to, in a sense, begin to ask ourselves, well, how far are we likely to continue with this? Because if you cannot get rid of the regime, if the regime is well entrenched, as I believe they are, and it's not going to be easy to get rid of them, then we have to look at the humanitarian side of things and see to what extent we have to sort of play for the longer term. That is to try to deal with the problem over a longer term and try to alleviate the humanitarian problem that we face right now. Now we have a number of countries in the region here. Trinidad is one. which are suffering as a result of having to deal with this refugee problem. And the countries are overwhelmed. Right around as you look at Peru, Chile, Colombia, all of them are overwhelmed by this refugee problem. Colombia, of course, has reacted a bit differently and agreed to register them for about 10 years. But if you look in Peru and Chile, you will see quite a different reaction. The Chileans and the Peruvians have decided that they have had enough and they're just sending them back across the border. So the question I'm asking myself is, how long can we continue to bear this cost? Bearing in mind that what is being given for humanitarian assistance is very, very small. I mean, I've seen calculations which show that assistance to refugees in Syria have been 10 times what has been given to Venezuelan refugees, which means that the countries themselves are being asked to bear the cost of that situation.
Excuse me, Dr. Gonzalez. Professor Gonzalez,
yes,
sorry.
Yeah, I'm finishing right now.
Okay, no problem.
I'm finishing right now. All I'm trying to say that put in context, add to that the COVID situation, which has made things much worse. And these countries have to bear that cost and face that situation. I'm asking myself, to what extent do we not need a kind of revision of the sanctions policy and a kind of new humanitarian approach to try to alleviate this situation? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Lewis to give his comments. Dr. Lewis.
Thank you all. I'm not sure if my 7 minutes still exist. Peter kind of took over, but I'll go ahead. Let me thank you all for inviting me to this forum. Join in late after you've had 3, so I'm very pleased to join in and to reconnect with many of you on this subject. It's amazing if you just change the names of the countries, how this is exactly what we've been discussing in the US for 2-3 decades on immigration, what the Europeans have been discussing. I focus a lot on Spain and Italy work and the mess that is European immigration there. And the key reason of Brexit was because of that. Now they jump into Spain from Africa. It's as close as Trinidad to Venezuela, and then they go into the rest of Europe. And it's a failure, just as it's a failure here and now in South America. Yet all the countries lambast the other countries, and then they do exactly the same or worse than what's happening. So that's really ironic. Secondly, I'd like to emphasize that migration is a symptom of an illness. It is not the illness. And we need to be very clear about that. What is the illness that causes migration and creates these rational economic animals who move to places where there are opportunities, where there are possibilities, and where the market allows them to be? It is not just, by chance. You find Chinese, Africans in Central America coming into the US. That is an amazing market-driven initiative. I've got a few comments which I was asked to do from the Washington perspective, but I'd just like to take advantage of the 7 minutes to go quickly with some of these points because they're critical in what not only Trinidad and Tobago, but the overall Caribbean is facing. The issues of immigration strategy, border control and management, critical. The issue of the numbers. 4 years ago, I said the trigger point was going to be 7 million refugees. And by then, it would not be the US who would need to take action against a failed state and an economic and an emasculated economy in Venezuela. It would be the South Americans, obviously with US support, but it will not be the US. We are now officially at 5 million, projections of 10 million in 2023. Let's see when we hit 7, what happens. People talk a lot about the US being infiltrated in Venezuela and so on. Whatever number you think the US may have in Venezuela, multiply it by 10, and those are Colombian black ops that have been embedded in Venezuela for over 10 years. That's how they did that famous Red Cross operation some years ago to rescue the legislator. And they know exactly what's going on in Venezuela every time, every second. And they are the ones who feed the intelligence to the Americans. It's not the Americans. Anybody, everybody concerned about military intervention in Venezuela, your problem is not Washington, D.C. Your problem is Bogota, and now Lima, and now Quito, and even Santiago. Your problem is not Washington, D.C. It will never happen from Washington. It will happen, I fear, from the South American neighbors. So that's a critical point to bear in mind. Everything having to do with the economy, it's the money trail, it's the mapping. You've done a lot of it, it's been mentioned. Remittances is something that has to be looked at. And really this has been worked on from the Latin American case. And I would suggest we all revisit Venezuelan economist Moises Naim's book, Illicit Trade. And it's not about illicit trade of, you know, shopping bags and shoes. And no, it's about everything that is illicit in the world, including peoples, animals, plants, and how it moves, and what that means for people who are trying to run licit trade regimes and customs and borders in their countries. The main problem we have, I believe, is that the key actor, which is Venezuela, is part and parcel of the problem, just in many ways as you have the governments in Central America and the governments in Mexico. And they all are part of that value chain of money that makes it substantiable. And if you think I don't look at it also from the US perspective, for years, I've been arguing to my colleagues in the State Department, in the DEA, and in the FBI, that if it is indeed a foregone conclusion, like government, private, academic studies have shown, that the center, the hub of narco traffic and weapons trade in the Caribbean is the Luis Munoz Marin Airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico, United States of America. How does that happen when that is an airport that is run by federal agencies? Just the same way as you're now seeing stories on the border in the US of US immigration officers and groups involved with their Mexican counterparts. Follow the money and you will find the value chain of it. I have argued for years, like it or not, there is a very lucrative money trail from Caracas to Port of Spain way before this crisis started, and it will continue. So in that sense, it's critical to take a look at that. So we have a demographic tsunami. In the Caribbean, a study will come out soon, in about a month or so, that there's about 200 to 250,000 Venezuelan refugees throughout the islands. Now, this, of course, includes Dominican Republic, it includes the Dutch islands, but the message is that 3,000 to 5,000 Venezuelan refugees in any little island creates a demographic chaos. You have Venezuelan narco cartel bosses in jails in St. Lucia. And from those jails, they are running their operations because the St. Lucia police and military are not capable of controlling that. So we need to take a look at that and understand what that's happening. From the political diplomatic perspective, which is what I wanted to comment, is really that both at the level of the international organizations, UN, OAS, the famous Lima Group, the EU, we are now getting a bit of a sort of a consensus in terms of this is out of control and we can't handle it. And whether we like it or not, or we agree or we disagree with the OAS, they are now taking the lead on many of these initiatives. Member states in the OAS need to realize that is the game in town. And you're going to have to figure out what are the costs and benefits and what are the best ways to strategically engage in that space. I have argued that the CARICOM division at the OAS is an issue of a variety of countries because we do not have either a national or a regional policy on this issue. taken the ostrich head in the sand approach, or the cocoon. And you see it. Let me just run for you the four most recent votes on resolutions in the OAS, all which passed with 21 plus votes, January 2019, August 2019, the October 2020 General Assembly, and the recent December 2020 vote regarding the illegitimate elections in Venezuela. And on all of them, you've had a core of 5 CARICOM countries supporting the resolutions: Guyana, Bahamas, Haiti, Jamaica, and St. Lucia, and then the Dominican Republic. You've had countries that I respect a lot because they are clear and integral in their stance: Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in those years, Suriname, which has now changed, and they have voted against. They are ALBA countries, they support the Venezuelan regime, and they stand by their position. And then we have a slew of CARICOM countries that flow between abstention, which my father taught me years ago is the act of the coward, and not even showing up for a vote, absent, as if this has nothing to do with me. St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Belize, and even Grenada, which is right there on the doorstep, and God forbid 3,000 Venezuelans land on the shores of Grenada, and that country is done. And it is amazing. And the Latin countries in the OAS, let's leave out the northern ones, cannot understand how in the Caribbean there is not an awareness that this is our problem as much as it is theirs. And it is not just about a few people coming in. You've discussed the guns, the drugs, the people, the money. This is not about, 6 decades ago, Williams and Barrow talking that we are non-aligned and so on. No, that's a nice intellectual academic justification for inaction. And in the world of a free market, of Darwinism, those who do not act are doomed to not survive. This is a very serious threat, numerical in ways that I do not see people in the islands understanding. And it's way past the deadline to understand it and take action like so many of you have discussed, because we've seen it. We don't need to just go talk to the Colombians, the Peruvians, and learn from that playbook, because at least they've been figuring out how can we absorb it. But I'll tell you one thing, 1.5 million Venezuelans in 40 million plus Colombia is nothing compared to 60,000 in Trinidad and Tobago, or the Dutch islands that now have 15% plus in their territories. This is very serious business, ladies and gentlemen. And if the governments don't pick up and move on this, you're going to be looking at threats of failed states in some of these islands, because there will just be no way that you can control it. And it's not just about having money. It's not about throwing money at it. It's about throwing strategic resources on border management, people management, human resources. The commander has listed the whole area. This is a critical situation, and I'm glad that you have been engaged in this, and hopefully this will have impacts on the discussions by policymakers and the private sector, who are also actors in this, some on the good side, some on the bad side, and civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Lewis. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Munoz Gomez to give his comments. Mr. Gomez?
Thank you, Kristen. And let me first thank the university for the invitation to participate on this session with the very esteemed panelists and renowned academics. Maybe in the next time, I think it will be even better if we have a more gender balanced panel. But my name is Felipe Munoz. I'm the Migration Unit Chief of the Inter-American Development Bank. And of course, I'm here just represent the bank and to give you some different vision, a more broader vision about what is happening with the Venezuelan migration. And I just want to mention that my previous work before I took the post as a director of the migration unit was the presidential, Colombia's presidential advisor for the migration crisis in Venezuela. Then some of the ideas that I'm going to express here is not just from the academic side or not just from the a seat in DC, is from the ground, because I live personally what is happening with the Venezuelan crisis. And I know this is a very contentious topic in Trinidad and Tobago. And I don't want to give you any naive vision, but a realistic one. There is not a single identical case about the migration in Venezuela in the countries. But yes, there are some tools that other countries have used, and maybe it could be worth to analyze. And excuse me, some of the ideas are pretty obvious, but I want just to give you three main ideas. First of all, it's about the magnitude and involvement. And the magnitude, the real figure, Christian, is 5.4 million Venezuelans that have fled the country. In R4B, which is the platform managed by the United Nations, OIM and UNHCR, report 5.4 million. Today is the second largest displacement in the world after the Syrian crisis. Don't forget that. And of course, it's different in any country, as my predecessor said. And in some countries, it's 4% of their population, as is Colombia, or 2% in Trinidad and Tobago, depend the number that you use, because we don't have an exact number that how many Venezuelans are exactly in your country. But in some cities, for example, like Lima, is 8% of their population in the last 4 years. Or in Barranquilla, which is a city, a Colombian city in the Caribbean coast, is 10% of their population. There is a large and massive and unprecedented situation in the region, and 84% of these migrants are in the Latin American and Caribbean island. And of course, in nominal terms, but of course also in relative terms, is a massive process. But any country, not any country, were prepared to receive that. But the message is this is a regional challenge. This is not only a problem for Trinidad and Tobago, not only for the Caribbean, and this is an international concern. And the involvement is not only to be had from the national government, but also from the local governments, the civic society and the academy. And this is why I'm very happy to be here in the university, because this is also an academic debate. But not any country have the capacity to absorb this massive migration thing. And we need to go together as a Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, but also with the support of the international community and the international development banks, to say to the international donors community that we need more support to can deal with this situation. And how it works, how this international support works. As far as the IDBs is concerned, we are working in forces displacement only 2 years ago, but we have a grant facility for $100 million just to help in 10 countries, just 10 countries in the region that have experienced the worst effect of this migration, of this strategy of the Venezuelan friends and the Venezuelan people. It's Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Guyana, Costa Rica, Panama, Belize, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago, and Dominican Republic. Then Trinidad and Tobago is one of the 10 countries that could receive funds, non-reimbursable funds, along some of the loans that have, if they decided just to go with that. But we have another tools. We have grant and technical assistance, we have studies, we have research, we convene dialogue with policymakers in the region. For example, we have a regional dialogue with the Caribbean countries and thinking about migration. And also we offer targeted migration training for public officials in the region. Then the main idea is that we are here just to support the government and to support Trinidad and Tobago and deal with this situation in 4 main areas. First of all, in access to registration and documentation. Second, how to help the entities, as some of you have mentioned, in strengthening the capacity to provide social services, water, sanitation, and housing, or social services as health, or even to helping the entities and the private sector to create a better environment, to provide economic opportunity and jobs. There are tools in the international community, and Trinidad and Tobago has to use these tools to have more people helping you in the challenge that you have, which is huge. but it's happened in all over the region. For example, in June, it will be a third donors conference leading by Canada, where we are going to go together as a Latin American and Caribbean countries and ask the international community that we need more support. And the third idea that I want to raise here is about the time framework. For example, we have working in Belize, where they have a lot of migrants. 15% of the population of Belize are migrants, and mainly from Central America, and they have a very dropout rates and learning gaps and language barriers that they need a quality improvement program, and they decided that they are going to include in this program also the migrants, and the Van Gogh with some non-reimbursable resources and helping the Belize government to include the migrants in the program. Or in Colombia, we have more than 4 projects helping, for example, some zones where have received a lot of migrants and refugees from Venezuela. And in a water program and sanitation, they include some migrant families, and in that way, we can put non-reimbursable resources. I know that some of you are thinking, hey, but the country is going to get a loan just to invest in migrant when you have their own needs for the local people, but this is not reimbursable money. This is like a win-win strategy that we can use in that. And let me give just 2 ideas about the registration process. I know that we recognize that Trinidad and Tobago have been making some efforts in this direction. Some of you have mentioned that the registration maybe could cover more people, or you have another challenges ahead. But this is the only way. This is the information, the research that we have. If you have a very organized process of registration, is the only way that could begin a process of real integration, because you know who the people are, who are their skills, have some of the doctors here said, who are the benefit, and there is not such a pull factor in this situation. In general terms, in the academic arena, there is like the idea that if you offer some benefit to the migrant, they could create like a pull factor, like the people then is going. In all the studies that we have in Latin America regarding the Venezuelan situation, there is not such pull factor. The people are leaving Venezuela not as a reason of the offers of the recipient countries. The people are leaving Venezuela because they are dying, because they don't have food, and because they are escape and flee from a very, very complex situation. And there is a lot of other research that you can observe, for example, about crime. I know that this is a very complicated topic. I was 10 years ago the director of the National Intelligence Agency in Colombia, and I know when you talk about international crime, but about citizen security, you could analyze also about perception. For example, you have a very, very good paper wrote by Marlon Anatol and Kinel Mari Kengale from the University of West Indies. And they say that the process of crime is not only caused by the Venezuelan migrants, and this has happened in all around the continent, in all the countries that we have. I don't want to sound naive. I just want to put in perspective that all the countries have dealing with the same process. We are here as an Inter-American Development Bank through our office, local office of the IDB, led by Rocio Medina Bolivar, and we maintain some contacts with the government. And we are here just to try to support, but especially to give knowledge, research, and tools that you can use when you as a country and the government just could decide to moving forward with this, which is a regional challenge. And I'm really happy just to be here and maybe to answer question later. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Munoz. Before you go, I just have one question. Would you be able to just speak to your experience as the advisor to the president of Colombia? What were your main strategic objectives? And if so, which of them do you think would be adaptable to the situation we're facing in Trinidad and Tobago?
It's pretty hard for me because I'm now in another, and I'm talking here as a representative of the IDB, but just let me say that the recent decision that Colombia has taken about to decide just to give a temporal protection status for 10 years, I think is complicated, it's costly, but it's the only way that you can lead with a challenge in this way. I think the decision of the registration in June 2019 is a right decision. We want to support this decision and maybe to explore if the future you could again have another of that. And with the people that you have the registration in the manner that you can have the more information of these people, especially not only the socio-demographic profile, but also the labor profile. What are their skills? You maybe could put this labor force in town, but also for security reasons, as you mentioned, if you have the real identification of the people, you can really separate the minority, which is the case in all other the countries in Latin America that commit crimes, and you don't feed the growing perception that are the migrants that create the citizen security. Of course, any case is different. I don't want just to put all the examples for Colombia just to fit here in Trinidad and Tobago. But what I said is from the Inter-American Development Bank, we have the experience and information from all over the region, and we are here just to work with the government and with all of you to helping with this challenge. Christian, thank you.
Thank you for responding, Mr. Munoz. Next, I'd like to just reach Mr. Hira. Dr. Hussein had a question. He said, would you be able to elaborate on 3 objectives of the task force that you mentioned? Mr. Hira?
Yeah, definitely. It has been a thought process that I have been expanding and exploring, and I'm in the process of really firming up, Dr. Hussein, perfecting the CAPE framework, the CAPE, which really deals with first, and I think you mentioned it, the comparative advantage, but more importantly, it treats with, and I have it right here, I have it right here in my notes, capacity building to deal with national security, the socioeconomic factor, agriculture, and more importantly, the impact of CARICOM. So that capacity building concept to be entertained there. The A in the CAPE framework would have been accountability, adopting a project governance approach. I've said this and I've spoken, I've actually written papers and done research on the project government approaches that if a certain amount of money is being allocated for a specific task, you set deadlines, you give timelines, and you hold people accountable for achieving these objectives. So I think a major aspect of the task force, an intergovernmental task force, is the accountability concept and developing or assuming or adopting the project governance approach. And P, it must be people-centered. It has to be people-centered and a healthy people systems approach. And we have all of the parameters that can be deposited into a people-centered concept. And of course, E, evaluation. And I like to use the 3 M's of evaluation: measurement, monitoring, and management. So how do we evaluate this concept of the task force? Who's going to be held accountable in the project governance aspect? But more importantly, the evaluation has to be portrayed in a way where it's transparency and it's open for that sort of measurement. Are we achieving our objectives? Dr. Lewis spoke about it in great detail of what are some of the mistakes being made by the big brothers. So we have to approach the evaluation aspect, a lessons learned approach, adopting international best practices and models, but utilizing it within our domain and understanding it's not a Trinidad and Tobago issue, far more not even a CARICOM issue. It is an international issue, and we are playing in a global village. I can expand on it at a later time, but it's the CAPE framework, and I'll be happy to speak more on it or present to you the details of that framework, Dr. Hussein.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hira. We have another question from our audience here. Mr. Patrick Gomes. Mr. Patrick Gomes, if you are present, would you like to unmute your mic so that you can ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and certainly congratulations to the presentations. I certainly think David Lewis was situating the debate in the level and context and scale that we need to give attention to it. It is really geopolitical, and in fact, it is necessary for us to be urgent in how we go about it. So I was asking, where are the studies being done? Who is coordinating it? What is happening in terms of policy formulation? And my view is hopefully that we would not be speaking of CARICOM so much, or at least of CARIFORUM, because the Dominican Republic is part of this aspect that is very, very critical. So I think it's an encouraging move, and the carry forward of work is to know how we can really have these things lead into some policy briefs, and the public will be more informed by genuine data. Well, thank you very much, and congratulations to organizers and the presentations.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Gomez. Okay, so Mr. Gomez also put forward a question. He is asking whether or not, or what agencies were undertaking the ongoing data collection and analysis on the impact of the Venezuelan migration and refugees on Trinidad and Tobago and other CARICOM countries.
No, there are a lot of agencies that are working just in data collection. For example, IOM has many recent data collection information about the numbers, not only the numbers, but also the situations. And I can send you to you through Rebecca, of course, Christian, some links that we have where there are other agencies and other NGOs that have made some research regarding the situation of the migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think it could be very useful for this academic community just to have a more broader vision about what is happening there. But yes, the numbers, for example, are still in debate. How many exactly Venezuelan migrants are in Trinidad and Tobago? We don't really know, but this is one of the reasons that maybe some of this process of registration could help in the government and the society of Trinidad and Tobago to have a better understanding of the process. But I'm going to send you the information, Christian, as soon as the meeting ends.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Munoz.
Christian, 1 second. Commander
Yes.
Hero.
Yes.
Yeah, just 2 minutes. Dr. Gonzalez spoke about something regarding the border control management. Dr. Lewis came back and mentioned it again. Now, I was almost crucified in the public domain for something that I said about 2 years ago, which was we are not thinking out of the box. We are not looking at international systems. When I said, if we have registered Venezuelans, we have legitimate Venezuelans who are seeking, for instance, immigration status and citizenship of Trinidad and Tobago, what is wrong in us considering recruiting some of them for our maritime services, even for our police services? It worked in the Florida channels with a Haitian situation. Dr. Lewis would have known that with some of the research he has done in his papers regarding that situation when they had a Haitian migration coming across the Florida channel, where they were recruited in the US Coast Guard and were used, for instance, to treat with border control management. You see it on the borderlines outside of Mexico, in California, and Houston. So it's something that is possible, where you can utilize legitimate Venezuelans to join the fight to treat with border control management. However, people who are not ready for such a thought are still not thinking out of the box, but we have to start utilizing in our entrepreneurial mindset the experimentation of utilizing working models internationally and applying it to our local theater.
Makes a lot of sense.
Thank you very much.
Christian, could I mention something?
Yes, please, jump in.
3 quick points I think we need to bear in mind on this. One, we would be remiss to think that all of this refugee migration situation from Venezuela is just people seeking better health, education, and care. There's a large flow, and it started originally from political refugees fleeing the fact of political persecution by the state in Venezuela and seeking asylum in many countries. And it's just not whether you have a leader like Leopoldo Lopez, who had to scurry through the Spain embassy and then run to the border in Colombia and then from there fly to Spain. There are tens of thousands of Venezuelans who have been involved in politics when it was a full-fledged democracy, representatives of many political parties, and they have been fleeing because of the destruction of a democracy, human rights, basic rights, rights of the media, and so on in Venezuela. Secondly, way before we have to worry about China, Russia, and Iran in Venezuela, that repressive state apparatus was built with the help and support of Cuba. And that is the conundrum for CARICOM states, because if you start on the roadmap of what is going on in Venezuela, at the end, the pot of gold or of shit, pardon my French, leads you to Havana and to the military security apparatus that prodded Chavez and Maduro. So there's a very strategic problem and dilemma for CARICOM states on that. And third, a bit more on the philosophical part of regional integration. I remember Norman Gervin, rest in peace, used to say, you know, we have a problem in the English-speaking Caribbean because we think that if you're not Black, you don't play cricket, and you don't speak English, you're not Caribbean. And I'm glad Secretary General Gomes mentioned the Dominican Republic and CARIFORUM, because leaving aside Haiti, we're talking about 5 million people, okay? 5 million people in 14 countries, and it's the 14 that makes us bat way above our numbers. You now have Venezuelans in Trinidad, Central Americans in Belize, Dominicans from Dominican Republic in Antigua and Barbuda for decades. And the challenge is, does the receiver nation integrate and assimilate these peoples as new blood into the system, or do we put up a barrier and reject them and then pay the consequences? And that is a serious philosophical question for our Caribbean regional integration movement, I would state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. I'd just like to invite Professor Gonzalez to jump in here, just to comment on what was shared by Dr. Lewis. Professor?
Yes, Christian. Just two small comments. I think, first of all, it's difficult to really reduce the importance of the big powers in this game. Yes, Cuba was initially important, but the way things have evolved, we have gone long past Cuba. I mean, now you're dealing with China and you're dealing with Russia that are massively supporting a regime. China with its massive loan, 60 billion odd that they gave to the Chavez government, and you're dealing with Russia that are supplying a sophisticated set of weapons that no government in this region has ever seen. And you have Russian advisors, Russian private sector people in Venezuela, and Russian military people in Venezuela that are training the Venezuelan army. So that you have to deal with that. This is the reality that is facing you. And they're not going away. They're not going to lie down and be rolled over by either Brazil or Colombia or the United States. So this is a reality that we have, I think we have to face and try to figure out how we deal with it. And it's my view, it is not Colombia nor Brazil that are going to finally determine this. It is essentially the large powers that are going to determine this. So I'm seeing this from an entirely different angle. And the point I am trying to make is that the key things that seem to be affecting the flow of migrants at this particular point in time is the severity of the sanctions. Yes, of course, initially, the flows out of Venezuela surrounded essentially the middle class, the upper classes, the educated people. This we saw in Cuba as well. But subsequent to that, what we saw was the poorer classes moving, as we see now, for example, the masses that are flooding to Colombia and to Peru and so forth are the lower classes, and they bring a different set of problems. When they come, it's not like the middle class and the upper classes. They bring money, they can adapt, they're not a problem as the lower classes. So we have to deal with what is coming at us now. And that is why you find that there's a reaction to Venezuelan migrants, which we haven't seen before. And until we could get some kind of support to deal with this, we're going to continue in the situation that we are, and we would not be able to properly handle it. And this is why I think a large part of the international community is calling for more humanitarian assistance. I think they're well aware of the fact that the countries cannot deal with it. Our colleague from the IDB, for instance, is referring to this. The countries are overwhelmed by what is happening to them, and they're not getting the kind of assistance that they need to really handle it. And we're not seeing this coming out of Washington nor the European Union. I think to some extent, these countries believe that these countries can handle this and that they don't have to put up the amount of assistance that they really need. So I think in a large sense, a lot of what is taking place in the region comes back to the powers that be, comes back to Europe, comes back to the United States, and to the extent to which they could act in a certain way, either through negotiation, through humanitarian assistance, through some kind of better diplomacy, they can alleviate things. I don't see the countries in Latin America, Brazil and Colombia and Peru and them in any position to deal with that kind of situation. They don't have the resources to handle that. So that in a sense, we need to try to employ the powers that be, these larger countries, to try and act with some kind of urgency to help alleviate the situation. And most of the studies that I have seen, what they show is that basic food and medicine at this point in time is what determining the flow of Venezuelans out of Venezuela. It's not human rights. If tomorrow the price of oil shoots up and Venezuela get resources and could provide basic food and medicine, you'll find a significant reduction in the flow of migrants abroad. And this is what I think we have, at least I am basically concerned with in the short to medium term. Thank you.
Christian, do you allow me just to answer one question?
Yes, go ahead. Christian has, for some reason, he got kicked out, but go ahead.
No, it's just to answer because Terry in say that if I can be more specific about the money that is given to Trinidad and Tobago, let me be very crystal clear. The bank has a fund that was created 1.5 years ago, and Trinidad and Tobago has the opportunity to apply to this fund, but has not applied, already has not applied. It's not any money that we are giving to Trinidad and Tobago. We are just beginning the work with the government. Of course, we have other countries have already applied, Colombia, Ecuador, Belize, Panama, Costa Rica, Chile, but we are in this work. And in what sectors, it depends on the conversation with the government. You can invest in so many things. That is around the 4 main priorities that the bank has, which is identification and registration, social services, basic needs, and employment opportunities. But I think it's important just to understand that that we are just in the first steps of the dialogue through our office in Trinidad and Tobago with the government, and hope if we have the opportunity, we can be involved in some operation in the near future. Christian, I have to leave in 10 minutes, but thank you again very, very, very much for this.
Thank you very much. We were blessed to have you. There is a question directed to Dr. Lewis from Mr. Fitzgerald. The question is as follows. The unilateral sanctions by the US that has led to most of the migration, do we continue sanctions or pivot to a strategy that actually works for the expected goal? And to that, do we need to ask what is the goal specifically of the US strategy?
So I think first and foremost, and we've been listening to the numbers, we need to make sure we understand the numbers and the flow pre-2019 and post-2019, because that's when those US sanctions kicked in. And while it's very clear that the sanctions have exacerbated the economic situation in Venezuela, and therefore the migration flow, like Peter is mentioning, they were not the root cause of it. But that's the nature of how sanctions work. I'm very old school on sanctions because my political life started with the divestment movement in South Africa. And except for one speech when he was in Havana as a guest of Fidel Castro, and therefore because he was a well-trained Anglo lawyer, he couldn't say anything. Everything that Mandela ever said was that sanctions and embargoes work, and were it not for that, I would not have been freed, the ANC would not have been allowed to participate democratically in politics, and apartheid would not have ended. And I would take that one case over every study ever just because I believe in the cause of that man. End of argument. That said, all of our countries are members in the UN and the OAS. Right now, whether we like it or not, the OAS has become the fulcrum of discussion, debate, and solutions to this situation. Abstaining is the least possible way that you're going to have any impact and any influence on what happens. And therefore, I believe the CARICOM countries have to participate actively, proactively in seeking some solutions and use that venue like it was done before. That's how the Lima group started, to work with the US administration, which is a new one. They've already established that they're not looking at removing the sanctions, so that may be a problem, but where at least other options can be looked at. And definitely the main concern now, as Peter mentioned, I agree with him, is that it's not just the Cuban concern, it's now Russia, Iran, and China. And I believe that's why the escalation in the geopolitics is diminishing the opportunity on the humanitarian side, but that should not mean that we give up, by no means whatsoever.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. Ladies and gentlemen, we've definitely had an enlightening conversation this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. At this time, I want to offer the opportunity to our panelists to give their closing remarks, and I'm going to ask Mr. Munoz Gomez to offer his first.
No, as I said before, thank you very much. This is a very informative panel, and we need to be more involved in the Trinidad and Tobago reality. I know this is complicated for some of the population, but also it's complicated for the Venezuelan migrants and refugees. We here as an Inter-American Development Bank are not only to really ready just to give the government of Trinidad and Tobago support with financial and non-financial tools, but also to be with the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean in the regional and worldwide forums, just to raise the voice about the magnitude and the very critical situation of the migration on Venezuela. Thank you very much, and hope to be with you again. Thank you, sir.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Dr. Lewis?
Yes, thank you. I would just like to, again, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to look forward to reviewing the previous forums. Commander, the research, I think, is critical because whether we like it or not, the data at the end of the day does not lie. I would just throw in, because this study will come out, I think, in about a month, on the 200 to 250,000 Venezuelans throughout the Caribbean. And one of the suggestions I made to the team was start looking at remittances. There's an entire industry in the US and Europe tracing the flow of remittances into sender countries and back to identify all the different players and actors in this chess match and be able to figure out where are there licit ventures and where are the illicit ventures that democratic states and the rule of law need to worry about, because that transnational crime issue is critical in terms of fighting this. This is not a few people off in Guaira sending people and making a little bit of money. And no, this is part of a global transnational crime operation. Venezuela, Trinidad may not be the top 10, but it's in there in the top 50. And that is very, very threatening. Thank you so much to all. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. Dr. Gonzalez, would you offer your closing comments? You will have to unmute your mic.
Yes, thank you very much, Rebecca. Yeah, I would like to close by saying that it's now 3 years and more that we are dealing with this crisis, and we don't see it as coming to any kind of meaningful solution. And we have seen where sanctions have been employed in many instances. David refers to South Africa, where it was successful, but it hasn't been successful in a lot of other cases. You know, if you just look around us, we are still dealing with Cuba. We are still dealing with Nicaragua. They have not gone away. They're there, and we have to try to live with them. So that I am worried that the extent to which we continue these kind of repressive sanctions, we're not likely to see a much greater flow of migrants that will put a greater burden on the surrounding countries. And is it not time for us to start looking at the humanitarian side and saying to what extent can we alleviate the pain of the Venezuelan people? The Venezuelan people are suffering. You know, the basics are just not there, and the economy is just going down and down and down. It's lost almost about 75 or 85% in the last 5 or 10 years, and there's no stop. There's nothing stopping it. So that my plea really would be to try to see to what extent we can work for some kind of improvement in assistance to the Venezuelan people, and we can find ways of doing this. I know there's a question of delivery. The government says that most of the aid must go through it. But I've seen arguments where you can get that aid to the Venezuelan people. And this country, for example, could easily participate in some kind of giving of aid. For example, in the eastern part of Venezuela, we have a lot of contacts in Tucupita, in Ciudad Bolívar, in the oriental part of Venezuela, and we could actively participate in assisting in the distribution of assistance to stop the flow of migrants coming. So my feeling is that it's time we start taking a much more realistic approach to this. The geopolitical situation is something that is such that it's not changing. It is helping the Venezuelan government to a large extent. The military is dug in, they have doubled down in Venezuela, and we're not going to get them out very easily like that. So we have to find some kind of a way to deal with this problem over the long run, bearing in mind the suffering of the Venezuelan people and all of us around Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez. Next, I'd like to give Dr. Tiwari an opportunity to give his closing remarks. Dr. Tiwari. Dr. Tiwari, you'll have to unmute your mic.
I will, thank you very much. I will zero in on 4 things if I can get through them and try to be very pointed on each one. But I want to thank you all for the opportunity here tonight. I thought we had a very rich discussion, and I thought we had very important perspectives, some of them, you know, contending with one another, but I think enriching the whole conversation, and I think that was very valuable. So my 4 issues. The issue of sanctions has come up, and you have 2 views here emerging tonight, which is Dr. Gonzalez basically saying that these things do not work. We need to take a more humanitarian approach. And David Lewis taking the view that sanctions do work using the South African case. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but what I do want to say is that the sanctions issue and how the issue of sanctions is dealt with by the United States has become much more complicated now because of the geopolitics. Because of the fact that you have Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran in Venezuela, but also engaged in economic and COVID diplomacy strategies across the South American region. I think that what is happening here is that the Venezuelans are going to dig in more than ever, and unless they are prepared to move to make the question of sanctions be revisited, I don't think that we're going to have any give on this matter. And I think the geopolitics complicates it, especially as all the geopolitics is not just in Venezuela now, but it's a hemispheric issue that is emerging throughout Latin America. The second thing is, and in that whole situation, that geopolitical situation, as David was pointing out earlier, the role of Cuba has changed in terms of its particular relationship with the Maduro regime and the role that it played there. So that there has to be some give from both Venezuela and Cuba on this matter to make the issue of sanctions be revisited and readdressed, and therefore to have a situation in which you can have a different kind of discussion. I want to mention this 7 million Venezuelan migrants threshold that David Lewis raised. I think it's an important question because we're almost there now. It's 5.4 million. And it is very likely that we are going to get there, and that has implications not only for the CARICOM region as a whole, but it has implications for Trinidad and Tobago right here on the border, you might say, of Venezuela. And I think that is going to, I mean, that is something, and we were not prepared for this migration. And I don't think we're doing anything to be prepared for anything more. And I think that puts us in a crisis situation and really in a situation that is hard to manage. And I think we have to do something about this, because before this thing becomes an overwhelming issue that cannot be managed at all, either by the individual territories or the region as a whole, and certainly by Trinidad and Tobago. Those of us who live here, I think we need to play a role that would allow us to be a lot more responsible in the way we manage what is likely to emerge. The third issue is the hemispheric solution and the role of the OAS. I mean, the United States in a fundamental way is trapped, because nobody wants an invasion of any country in the Americas. The sanctions issue is an issue in which people have divided positions. And people know that the Maduro regime cannot be allowed to stay there forever, geopolitics or no geopolitics, because it is going to have unmanageable consequences for the rest of the region. And therefore, the engagement of the OAS as an institution and the management of the situation in the hemisphere, in which the countries of the hemisphere take responsibility in the hemisphere and have dialogue, discussion, side discussions, etc., in order to help to resolve this, I think is important. Because whatever you do, you have to have diplomacy work, even as you have partners help you in the process from other places that you sometimes don't imagine. And then the final thing that I'd mention very quickly is that, I mean, anything that I look at, I try to look at from the Trinidad and Tobago point of view, and I want to ask a few questions about Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is now stuck as a middle-income country. And after 6 years of economic decline, it has a 10% smaller GDP than a decade ago. How can it get out of this middle-income country trap if we do not have additional human resources in this country as one ingredient? All right, we have to do 1,000 other things, which I won't mention here. But how could we not look at the migration of Venezuelans here as an opportunity rather than a liability, if we can contain it to what it is now, rather than let it escalate? Secondly, Trinidad and Tobago has an aging workforce, a birth rate of 0.5% annually. Can it move forward economically in a sustainable way without immigration? I don't think we can. I think we need more people to be able to do that. And we missed the boat because we did not manage the migration, either from Venezuela or anywhere else, to get the kind of skills that we really needed for development. But we have to work with what we have now, and we need more people. Thirdly, I would say that we have to deal with this reality we have living on our shores now, the neighbors, the people from Venezuela. We talked a lot about the history and so on. It is not something that is that alien to us. And we've got to manage this. And finally, I'll just close on this. Can Trinidad and Tobago turn immigration from Venezuela into a transformative asset and opportunity rather than a problem and a liability? And can we do that by learning from what other countries have done well? And can we also do that by making some structural changes in Trinidad and Tobago, not for the purpose of managing immigration, but because it's necessary anyway, but it will help with immigration integration. And that is to have a system of functional and workable multi-level governance, in which the central government and local government, effectively empowered, actually can manage the development of local communities and parts of the country as the central government takes a macro perspective on what we need to do for development. So that would be my contribution. Again, thanks again for the opportunity to contribute. And everybody who spoke tonight, I mean, you all were so rich, so eloquent, so strategically valuable in the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. And finally, we have Commander Hira. Just a word, just wanted to apologize on behalf of Dr. Hussein. He has been trying to rejoin the meeting, but is having trouble doing so. So, Commander Hira.
I will close by endorsing each panelist and the contribution of the need for future research and the business continuity plan from that macro development approach, as Dr. Tiwari would have closed a bit. I think it's very, very important for the consideration of the task force, the governmental task force that prioritizes this issue. This is not a start and stop issue. There's no timeline, shelf life to it. This is going to be continued. And I mean, hearing from the likes of Dr. Lewis, Senior Munoz, Dr. Tiwari, and even Dr. Hussein and Dr. Gonzalez, the contributions have all painted the canvas that this problem is here to stay. How do we turn this problem from a crisis into something that could be beneficial to our country? I'm thankful Dr. Lewis used the analogy of the chess game, because if somebody moves their knight in the wrong direction, what we're not recognizing, we've all seen it. I don't know why others aren't seeing it. Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension, certain parts of the Caribbean now becomes a conflict zone. They don't understand the effects of what is a conflict zone and how that is going to impact a country, both from its airspace, its maritime space, its the industry, our survivability. If someone moves their knight in the wrong direction, Trinidad and Tobago can become a conflict zone because of the international players that are on this chessboard. And we have to understand that this situation warrants prioritization, urgency, and a political will that will develop a strategy to be able to manage the scenario as it is presently without a reactive but proactive and predictive approach. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share, and I look forward for the other conversations. It was indeed a privilege, and thanks again for the contributions.
Thank you very much, Commander Hero. And we at TIDU would just like to thank all of our panelists, Drs. Tiwari, Gonzalez, Hussein, Lewis, and Mr. Munoz. We really appreciate your taking the time to come here and join with us to really thoroughly interrogate this geopolitical issue that is facing us here in Trinidad and Tobago and in the wider region. So everybody, with that, we bid you all good night. Stay safe. Please remember to wear your mask and social distance. I beg your pardon?
Empahadables with slight pepper.
Empahadables with slight pepper. I think I'll go try one right now. Thank you very much.
Good night, all. Yes, all
okay. Thanks again, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Yeah, you too, yeah.